Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another week of Comp 2. This week, we are talking about the IVCC Stylebook pages 72 through 89 and your EmpoWord textbook chapter 3. So if you want those open while we talk, that might be a good idea. Otherwise, let's go. So I'm right here in the Stylebook starting on page 72. And again, as I always do, I'm going to encourage you to read all this really thoroughly and contact me with any questions that you have. But today I just wanted to kind of go over some of the highlights with you. So we're starting to talk about how to use sources in our essay. And as you know, for your first essay, you have selected an author, and hopefully by now you have selected a text that you're going to mention in essay 1. As we proceed throughout the rest of the semester, we will continue to work with citing sources. So this is kind of our first encounter with our source use and how to cite them today. And we're going to continue to develop these skills throughout the semester. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed right off the bat, I would advise you not to worry about that and contact me with any questions you have, because this is what we're all about in Comp 2. So back to the style book. The first section that I asked you to read is about using sources well. Now, it's pretty easy for your first essay to select a credible source because I've already approved your author and hopefully whatever text it is that you're looking at. Moving forward, we'll be thinking very carefully about credibility of secondary sources. So the source that you're writing about for the encounter with the author essay is considered a primary source. That's the only one we'll use for this essay. Later in the semester, we will also bring in secondary sources, which are sources about the primary source, but we'll get there. So when we're using our sources, we always want to think about presenting our information fairly, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit here. And we also want to be thoughtful about how much source information we should be using. And the style book gives you some different tips and tricks for how to go about selecting source use and about how much you should use in your essay. Now, when you're thinking about where to use source information, typically that information is going to appear in your body paragraphs. We might see a quotation or something used in an introduction as an attention getter. We might see it used in a conclusion as kind of a thought-provoking final sentence. But when we're using as evidence or as details to support an idea or develop an argument, that should appear in your body paragraphs. And on page 70, I think about 73 of the style book, it gives sort of a basic pattern for a paragraph. And I would love everybody to look at that really closely, because it's going to remind you about the importance of starting with a clear topic sentence, introducing a detail, and then developing that, perhaps by bringing in some evidence. We'll then bring in an introduction, a quotation or a paraphrase from a source to support that idea. We'll explain that cited material. Why did we use this source material and how does it support our main idea? And then we will include a concluding sentence. So if you need a refresher on how to write a really solid paragraph, you can start there. You may be wondering for essay 1, should I be using quotations or should I be using summaries or paraphrases? And the answer is it's really up to you. However, the common belief is that using a mixture of summaries and quotations is usually the most preferable for your audience. So I would advise you, try not to use only quotations throughout an entire essay. Try not to use only summaries or paraphrases throughout an entire essay. Instead, try to use a mixture of those two types of source use, and that's going to keep your reader engaged and a little bit more excited about your writing. It's a good idea to use a direct quotation when the language is really striking and powerful and there's sort of no better way to say it. And it's a really great idea to use a quote or a paraphrase when the wording's not especially striking, but you still want those ideas. Of course, summaries or paraphrases, whatever term you'd like to use, are useful for when you have a really big piece of information, but you don't need it all. So I could summarize the movie Titanic, which is like 3 hours, by saying a bunch of people got on a boat and it sank, right? So I took a big piece of information and I put it into my own language and was able to summarize it there. The most important thing when summarizing or paraphrasing is that you're using your own language and sentence structure, and I'll talk more about that in a bit here. Now, when we are bringing sources into our writing, it is very important that we introduce them smoothly. So I'm going to skip past all this stuff about sort of determining credibility of sources, because we're going to cover that more later in the semester. And I'm jumping down to the bottom of page 77 in the style book that talks about introducing quotations. And I actually have a little PowerPoint that I'll show to you here, just to review basically what it says in the style book and those 3 different methods of introducing quotations. So if this is something you're familiar with, great. But for those of you who need a refresher, here we go. So again, this is all explained in the style book, and I would ask you to read through this very thoroughly. But what I'm focusing on are these 3 methods for introducing quotations, because this will be important in your writing this semester. So when you're introducing quotations, there are 3 sort of typical methods that we use that are a simple, easy way to keep your quotes grammatically correct in the flow of your sentence and in the flow of your paragraph. So when you're looking at your source and you're starting to gather your quotations, there's some questions you might ask yourself. So who said it? Is there an author available for the quotation? Is the person who said the quote the same person who wrote the story that you're reading, or are they quoting someone else? If there's no author available, you might ask yourself at this point, what is the title of my source? Because that's something you're going to need later on when it comes to citing the source. Number 2, you can ask yourself, where did they say it? So where were you able to find this quote? Was it on a website? Was it in a book? A really key question you can ask yourself at this point is, does my source have page numbers? That will be important when we cite that source in a little bit. Of course, it's important, what did the source say? Was it a very striking piece of wording that you want to capture in a quotation? And if so, I'll show you how to do that shortly here. And then I would say, most importantly, how do I interpret what this person said? So it's all well and good to go out and gather evidence to support your ideas, but the most important part of that paragraph and the most important part of your essays overall are your ideas. So those sources should always be working to bolster and support your ideas, not necessarily provide them for you. Now, when you're analyzing a text, it's important that you stay in the present tense. So for example, I have an example down here that says, Graph writes, if I am right, then schools and colleges are missing an opportunity when they do not encourage students to take their non-academic interests as objects of academic study. That's one thing I'm encouraging you to do this semester, is maybe choose a text that might not be considered academic interest and write about it. But as I say in my second bullet point here, every time we're reading a text or discussing it, it's like it's coming alive again for us in the present. So does this mean that every single verb in your essay should be in the present tense? No, that would be extremely confusing. But when you're referencing your writer, if I chose Stephen King, I might say, I was very terrified by the scene where Danny is trapped in the cement tube. And if you've only seen the movie and haven't read the book, you missed that really scary scene. So you'll notice that it was okay for me to use a past tense when I said, I was frightened by that. But if I were to bring in a quote from that, I might say, I was really frightened by this scene. King writes, comma, and then include a really scary quotation from that piece. So it's not that every verb has to be in the present tense, but those signal phrases, those words that you use to tell your writer that you're transitioning to a quote or a paraphrase, should appear in the present tense. If you would like to see a list of signal phrases, you can find that in the style book. You can find them in your EmpoWord textbook, or you can just Google signal phrases and you'll come up with a whole big list of them. So here comes our methods for introducing quotations. These are simple ways that you can create a quotation that is grammatically correct within the longer sentence it appears in, and also within your paragraph. So the first method is the incomplete sentence with a comma. So you'll notice there's a comma that separates the signal phrase from the quote. The signal phrase is in present tense, as I mentioned before. The period should follow the parentheses, and you might place the author's name with the signal phrase or in the citation at the end of the sentence, but we don't need it both places. So let's take a look at a few examples. So my first example is from a source with no page numbers, as you'll notice. And you'll notice also that I cited the author right next to my signal phrase here. So we have Leo says, comma, here begins my quotation marks, Barbie will probably survive, but the truth is she's in a lot of trouble. So I noticed I ended here with my period and then my quotation marks. Now this source does not have page numbers, so I simply don't need to include them, right? It's very easy. This next source does have page numbers. So again, I identify the author right next to the signal phrase, Fowles writes, comma, the continuous pressure is to create ads more and more in the image of the audience's motives and desires. You'll notice here that this quotation came from page 48 of a book. So instead of ending my sentence right after the quote, I need to include my page number in the parentheses. My period is always going to follow my citation. Remember, your period is part of your citation is part of your sentence. So you don't want to end the sentence until you've captured that citation with your period. The last example just shows you a little bit of a different way to format the quote. Again, you'll notice I still have those two key pieces of citing in MLA format. I still have the author and I still have the page number. I just put them in a little bit of a different position. So here, instead of using the author's name, I just said the author claims the Barbie doll teaches a child to conform to fashion in her consumption. Here we have the author's name and the page number in the citation at the end of the sentence, again, because I did not clarify that author at the beginning. So all of these are correct. It's just up to you what type of source you have and where you want to place that author's name. The second method is the complete sentence with a colon. So again, instead of incomplete with a comma, this method uses a complete sentence and then a colon before leading into the quotation. So again, that signal phrase will appear in present tense, and you may place the author's name in the sentence or in the citation in the parentheses at the end of the sentence. It's up to you. So here are some examples again with the complete sentence and the colon. So the first one says, Lassen points out that we are all in a cult, yet able to dream, colon. Always, always you have been free to dream. So notice that that first sentence is complete, and that's why it gets a colon. If it were incomplete, that's when we would use the comma. The next example, again, just a little bit of a different placement. Instead of naming the author at the start with the signal phrase, I've placed it down at the end in the citation. So I said, he illustrates the definition. Sales speak is any type of message surrounding a transaction between two people. And the author's name appears in the parentheses at the end. In the last case, we have an author and a page number. And again, I could place those both in the parentheses at the end of that sentence. But instead, what I chose to do was to use the author's name at the beginning and the page number at the end. So all those methods are correct. It's just up to you, what style you would like to use. The last one is really simple. It's just integrating bits of quotations into your own sentence. So you don't need any special punctuation if you can just sort of drop it in naturally into your flow of words. You would just punctuate it and capitalize it like you would with any other sentence. Always, always, whenever we're taking words word for word from a source, in other words, verbatim from a source, it needs to appear in quotation marks. Now, if you have two words in a row from a source, do you need to put it in quotation marks? No. I mean, imagine how many times you would have to cite words like and the. You would have to do that over and over and over again. A good sort of rule of thumb to follow is that if you have more than 3 words in a row from a source, go ahead and cite it. Okay, that's just like a general rule of thumb you can follow. So again, when you're integrating into your own sentence, no special punctuation, and that author's name might appear early in the sentence, or it might appear in the citation at the end. What's really important with this method is that the whole sentence needs to still be grammatically correct. Now that's true and for all 3 of these methods, but this one I think is sometimes the most challenging to actually make that happen. So here are a few examples. Again, some have page numbers, some don't, and you'll notice the author's name appearing different places. So the first one is a source with no page numbers. It says advertisements are present in schools because they slavishly serve their corporate sponsors. So again, there was no sort of, I didn't need like a colon or a comma to introduce that quote. It just flowed right into my sentence. So I just placed my quotation marks around the quoted material, and I made sure to cite my source at the end. Okay, a very similar example in the middle there that I'll let you read on your own. And the last one, again, this is just an example of how you might sort of separate the author from the page number, and that's perfectly acceptable. So this version says that Fox notes that the child's bus, here's the quote, equipped with the latest wraparound billboard, drove him to school. So again, just drop those quotations around the quoted material and make sure you cite your author and page number if you have them. Now you're also going to be using summaries and paraphrases. So the really important piece about these, again, is that it must appear in your own language and your own sentence structure. So what is not sufficient would be to simply go into the quote and pluck out a few words and replace them with synonyms. That is still plagiarism, right? It's even considered plagiarism if you sort of copied the structure of several sentences in a row. Maybe you change some words around here and there, but the overall structure is still the same. That's going to be considered plagiarism too. So to be very certain when you're citing summaries and paraphrases, and what I actually recommend that students do is read your source, close it, write your summary or paraphrase, and then open that source back up and make sure you weren't too close to the original wording. I actually had to do this just in one of my own essays I was writing for the course that I'm in. I noticed that I had stuck very close to the original source language. So I just went ahead and changed it into a direct quote. I didn't have a better way to say it clearly, so I used the direct quote instead. Now, when you're citing a summary or a paraphrase, you're going to do that the exact same way that you do with a direct quotation. So in MLA style, we're always going to be looking for the author and the page number. If we don't have page numbers, like for a website, we just don't include them. So it's really, really simple. This will probably be more relevant later in the semester, but if you do happen to run into a source that has no author, we'll just use the title of that source properly formatted. And then I give you an example on this page of what that might look like. Again, that's probably not relevant yet, and I'll talk about that more later in the semester, but I'm just throwing that out there in case anyone runs into that right now. Now, as the Stylebook reminds you, you can change and omit words in a quote. So to change a quote, you can use brackets, as I show you in the example on my screen. And that shows the reader that you needed to clarify something. That's usually the purpose of including those brackets. So for example, there might be an unclear pronoun reference where in your quote, it says she, but if we haven't read that whole paragraph, we don't know who exactly they're referring to. You might replace the word she with in brackets that person's name. Or you might, after the word she, put in brackets that person's name. Both ways would be acceptable, okay? If you want to omit words, you use the 3 dots, dot, dot, dot. That's called an ellipses mark. So now you know that. And again, sometimes maybe you just don't need the entire page or the entire paragraph, but you do need some sentences that are separated from each other. You can just use the dot, dot, dot to show that you have dropped some words out. So you can see in the example here that I took from the Stylebook, the first version of the paragraph includes a lot of details. The second version only includes the details that the writer needed for their essay. They didn't need all the specific dates and different incidents. They just needed the sort of main idea. So again, if you notice those ellipses, those 3 dots in the middle, those show the reader that they left something out that wasn't necessary. Now, of course, what's the most important part of using sources is number one, that you analyze them. As I mentioned before, the purpose for using evidence is to support your ideas. So whenever you include a piece of evidence, a quotation, a paraphrase, a summary, you should then analyze it in your own language to show us how it's supporting the main idea of that paragraph, or maybe even the main idea of the essay. Don't let that quote speak for itself. Go ahead and explain to us in your words how it supports your argument or your claim. Okay, so you might also be wondering, like, how much source use am I supposed to have in my essay? So different teachers and different writers will give you different guidelines. I think a pretty good rule of thumb to stick to, and that we tend to agree on in our English department here at IVCC, is about 20 to 30% of your essay comes from outside sources. So for example, that might show up in your essay as in every paragraph having 2, 3, or 4 pieces of evidence. And again, it just depends on each individual writer, how much evidence they're going to bring in, and you know, how much they analyze it. But what is the most important is that your ideas are at the forefront. Okay, we're the most interested in what you have to say about your author and the story you have to tell. One other super important element of using sources is that we must fairly represent the ideas presented in our sources. This is a huge problem just in our sort of society in general right now. This idea of taking things out of context and presenting them differently to support a different agenda than the original creator intended. So we should never omit something from a source or change something from a source or unfairly interpret something from a source in order to only to support our own ideas. We have to fairly represent the ideas and the spirit of the ideas that is presented in the source. So the example that I often use is, you'll see this happen a lot with movie reviews, right? Where the movie reviewer will say something like, this movie is a wonderful example of just how crappy screenwriting has gotten lately. And then someone uses some ellipses to take out some words, and suddenly a review appears of this movie that says this movie is wonderful. Well, that was not really true to the spirit. You may have captured the words from that source, but you twisted the meaning of it. That's something we want to really stand against, just as ethical consumers of information and as ethical citizens, and certainly as ethical writers in college. So always fairly represent the ideas of your sources to the best of your ability. So if you wanted to take a quick pause here and gather your thoughts, that might be a good place to stop. And then I just have a little bit from the EmpoWord textbook, chapter 3, about reflecting on an experience. So in your encounter with the author essay, as I've mentioned before, you're really telling us a story about a story. And that story often centers around you and your author. So when we're engaging in reflection, as I'm asking you to do in this essay, I'm asking you to help your audience construct meaning from the story that you've told. So your audience wants to know why this story matters, right? How did this experience affect you or change you? What did it teach you? Does it hold any relevance for your audience? Okay, so we often consider reflection as a means of looking back in order to look forward. So your essay is not just about the nostalgia of discovering Shel Silverstein at the age of 5 or whatever it might be, but instead, we're going to think about that diegetic gap between ourselves and the story that we're telling. So unless you're like a major English nerd like me, you've probably never heard this word diegetic or diegesis before, but it basically just has to do with the story that you're telling. And the diegetic gap is the distance between the you that appears in your story and the you of today. And when you're able to identify that diegetic gap, we can often identify the meaning within that gap. So, for example, if I think about the story I told you folks in the assignment sheet about me being like a 10 or 11-year-old girl and wanting to read Stephen King and being really afraid, and then like checking the book out and my hands were trembling, and then, you know, it turned into this sort of lifelong love affair with Stephen King. I, as a 40-year-old woman looking back on that now, can see some qualities in myself that became important for me later in my life. This idea of questioning authority, this idea that no one was going to control the knowledge that I consumed, right? This idea that just because it might be too scary for you doesn't mean it's too scary for me. And again, I could go on, and maybe I could come up with some things that were more profound if it wasn't just off the top of my head. But that's what I'm going to ask you folks to think about in your encounter with the author story. So it's not just about the you in that moment, right? That fearful little girl in the library checking out a book, but it's also about the you of today and what the you of today now knows and understands about yourself in the world that maybe you didn't know, you know, during your encounter moment that you're writing about. So that's all I have for you folks today for this week's video. I'll just remind you again, as I always do, to go back and read that stuff really thoroughly and to send me any questions that you may have. If you have any questions about Essay 1, about the due dates for the generating ideas or rough draft, please feel free to contact me as usual. And otherwise, have a great day, and we'll see you back here next week. Bye-bye.